Hey guys, this is Bearwire, and I'm here with my first ever video for HUSNG.com. And what I'm here to talk about is adjustments and overall strategy for play in deep stack sit and goes. So the structure, if you're not familiar, that I'm referring to, can be found on Full Tilt. It's a 1020 starting level with 3,000 chips, and I believe the blinds escalate at the reg speed increments between levels. I might be mistaken there, but the point is that it starts with 150 effective big blinds and moves slowly from there. So my goal in this video is to get you guys who have maybe not had so much experience above 75 big blinds, or even 50 big blinds, to get a little more comfortable trying sit and go structures that play as deep as 150 blinds. So what I'm going to start with here is an outline of a couple different types of players that pretty much everyone will run into in your everyday games. And the reason for that is obviously that we need to react a little bit differently for different player types. And I think it's more useful rather than to give you just broad deep stack advice. I'd like to say against certain player types, adjustments are going to be more dramatic. Against other player types, you might not see a big difference. And that's pretty important to point out. So, first of all, I'm going to discuss just your regular run-of-the-mill tag. This is, I guess, who you would consider your tough regular, someone who's going to open a lot of buttons. And I say can fold to 3-bets and can 4-bet. I don't want to hinge too much on the fact, their exact frequencies, but the point is that we're playing against someone who's not going to always call, someone against whom we can't always expect to fold or something like that, someone who's not obviously exploitable in basic preflop situations. And I say primarily fit or fold post-flop and capable of bluffing. Again, basically just saying that they don't have glaring leaks. This is a regular. This is someone who's going to give us a little bit of trouble, but obviously we're going to try and find ways to exploit them. The second type of player I'm going to go over a little bit is loose passive fish. Usually limp calls the button for those of you who, I guess, are a little stat-oriented. I just wrote in 90-25 as an example of how their preflop stats would look. Just very high VPIP, playing from both the small and big blind, but only opening about top 25% of hands. Just your strong range of, I guess, broadways, aces, pairs, stuff like that. So, I guess other semi-important factors are that this type of player basically never 3-bets or 4-bets. Maybe 2% of the time with queens or better or whatever. And very passive post flop, calling too much, etc. And then lastly, I want to look at how we're going to adjust against a maniac, someone who's going to open a lot of buttons, peel a lot of hands pre-flop, 4-bet a lot, 3-bet a lot, play back a lot post-flop, just generally hates folding, and likes to put money into the pot. So first, what I want to look at is how we're going to build our pre-flop ranges at 150 big blinds. General adjustments, before I go into my exact ranges, is that we're going to be, obviously at 150 blinds, we're going to be less happy getting all in pre-flop with certain hands. So we're going to have tighter requirements to get it in. But we're also going to have better implied odds. So we're going to be calling a little bit more often with those type of hands. So my personal preference, and I put this out here simply as a guideline. I'm not trying to say play these hands. It's correct, because pre-flop can be very vague, and these things are, in my opinion, strongly stylistic preferences. But as an overall idea, of what someone who's adjusting to deep stack play might do in this situation. I'm going to 3-bet 9s and ace queen or better. This is just strictly my value range that I feel comfortable against an unknown player. Putting in a 3-bet against this is against a 3x raise. Actually against a min raise, I'd probably flat 9s just because it makes stacks effectively even deeper. And I say some bluffs. Again, it's sort of a stylistic preference how much you bluff, and I probably 3-bet bluff a little bit too much. But depending on how comfortable you are, this could range from, as often as your value 3-betting to twice as often to close to never. It's really not. It's not terribly important when we're playing an unknown because that usually just means it's near the beginning of the match and we're an unknown to him as well. This is a rough outline of what I'm defending. I'm not going to repeat it all because it's a mess to say out loud, but basically I'm defending a lot of hands, and again, this is assuming a 3x raise at 150 big blinds. But you'll notice it's mostly, pairs and suited hands, suited aces and kings, suited connected hands. I actually left out a lot of stuff that I think I accidentally put down here, but not up there. Yeah, so you'll notice that in my range that I said to defend against a 3-bet, I have things like 4-5 suited to 10-9 suited, 5-7 suited, 6-9 suited, 7-10 suited. Those are also hands that I would defend against a 3x raise. Obviously, if I'm willing to defend them against a 3-bet, that's a little silly to fold them to an open. But this is a rough idea. It's important to note that at 150 big blinds, I'm not really interested in defending hands like ace-8 off to a 3-bet. I'm not really interested in defending hands like queen-9 off, king-8 off. These are just kind of troublesome hands at deep stacks, just basically because, like I hinted at, that at 150 blinds, you kind of need a stronger hand to get stacks in. So primarily we're looking for hands that make straights and flushes and things of that nature, rather than just naked high card value. Ace-8 and king-9 and the likes are a little less valuable when 3-bets go in at 150 big blinds. And those of you who have played at 150 big blinds have probably run into trouble with those exact type of hands. And my best advice is either to bluff with them or just to pitch them. It's not really the type of hand you want to play passively and try and get a lot of bets in with top pair. 4-betting, again, a tight range. It's my personal preference to defend with ace-queen, and I'm sure that a case can be made to 4-bet ace-queen. But, again, this is against an unknown, and personally I prefer to play a little more cautiously, especially in such a slow structure as a deep stack. It's really kind of conducive to playing a little bit more cautiously than normal. So, as is the overall theme of these ranges, when you are deep, I guess 150 blinds is what I would call deep in this situation, very deep as you can get in a heads-up sit and go. Implied odds, hands like 5-7 suited, have much more value than raw high card value. That's also reflected by the fact that I'm not 3-betting hands like King Jack at this stack depth, because the fact that we have broadways becomes a little bit more troublesome out of position, extremely deep, versus at 75 big blinds, where anytime we flop top pair, it's a no-brainer. It gets a little bit trickier, and hopefully I'll explain that a little bit better with some hand histories later on in the video. It's my personal experience that if we're playing an unknown, and when I say an unknown, I don't mean an unknown regular. If we're aware that we're playing a regular, we can be a little bit more confident that 3-bet bluffing will work. But at deep stacks, good and bad players alike are going to just fold less often. Bad players because they never fold in general, and good players because they realize that the deep stacks and the good implied odds give them the opportunity to fold less often pre-flop. So going in with no reads and bombing away with all sorts of light 3-betting is really going to get you in trouble. Another thing, despite being deep, we've sort of built these tight ranges with the intention of being comfortable getting all in with these hands. Tens are better and ace king are obvious 4-bets and get it in. And when I'm 3-betting, nines are better, ace queen are better. I'm not intending to fold those to a 4-bet. I am intending to stack off with those hands. It's not until I have a stronger read on my opponent that I'm willing to do something differently. And hence, we should do our best to get those reads and adjust accordingly. So, say that we have established our opponent as a tag regular. So what we're going to do here is look at some basic ways that I think that we can exploit a tag regular. So first thing is that we can be a little bit more comfortable 3-betting our bluffs. Hands like 9-5 suited, or 4-5 suited, or 6-7 offsuit. These are hands that I'm going to be pretty comfortable 3-betting against. And I'm picking them if it isn't obvious because these are hands with good equity, but at the same time these are hands that I don't generally defend. So for example, I was saying that my defending range is going to include something like 6-8 suited, because I feel like that's strong enough to call against a 3x raise at 150 big blinds. But say, for example, that we have 9-4 suited or 9-5 suited. This is a little bit more speculative of a call, especially against a tag who's going to be, as far as we know, relatively aggressive post-flop, putting us in some difficult spots. I think it's a pretty speculative defend. So for that reason, we take these hands that are, sort of on the cusp between calling and folding, and we 3-bet with them as a bluff. And just looking at an overall game plan, that's the most effective way to take advantage of our equity. Because if we start 3-betting hands like 8-9 suited just because we want to 3-bet, what we're also doing is we're not calling with those hands. And then we have to actually not only establish that 3-betting is profitable, but we also have to establish that 3-betting is more profitable than calling. And it's a little bit... I mean, if you have a specific reason to believe that it is, then that's fine. And by all means, go ahead and 3-bet just everything that's suited and connected and all sorts of things. But when our basic read is just that we're playing an aggressive regular, if we think we can defend 8-9 suited profitably, and we also think that we can 3-bet 9-4 suited profitably, then we have a pretty obvious decision to flat with 9-8 suited and to 3-bet with 9-4 suited. That said, if we really, truly believe that 3-betting is the best play with just all of these hands, then by all means, go ahead. So again, one of our assumptions about the tag regular is that he's going to be playing relatively straightforward post-flop. So for that reason, in 3-bet pots, we're going to be c-betting almost any board texture, save for maybe 9-8-6 two-tone when we have ace-jack off or something like that. But essentially, we're going to pick up the pot an extremely significant percentage of the time. And we're also going to be able to get away with a bet sizing that shows a lot of profit. We are deep, so it is worth noting that our bet sizes in general should be larger. Excuse me. It's for example, if we were playing at 75 big blinds and we had 3-bet, it wouldn't require a very large bet to get stacks in across 3 streets, and it would actually be preferable just to get stacks in on 2 streets. But there's a stack size, somewhere between 75 big blinds and 150 big blinds, where it'd be pretty easy to get stacks in across 3 streets, even if your c-bets were only 1/3 of the pot or something like that. But at 150 big blinds, it's probably going to require something like a 1/2 to 2/3 pot c-bet, and then maybe a 3/4 size turn and river c-bet to get stacks in. So for that reason, we don't want to go too small, but we want to go basically as small as we can get away with. And these are a lot of factors to weigh, but the most important one is that if we're playing against someone in this situation whose leak that we've identified is that he folds too much on the flop, then our primary concern should just be to profit frequently on the flop. I know that it's been discussed that a big leak is defined as a leak that comes up not only in large pot situations occasionally rather than rarely, but also in small pot situations that come up frequently. Well, if we've determined that that the tag regular has a leak, that he is folding too much in 3-bet pots, which is obviously a fairly large pot, then if we can get into this situation frequently and force him to make this mistake as frequently as possible, then we've created for him a big leak, which is obviously our goal. And I say exploit the inelasticity of his decisions. Essentially what I mean is that if he is literally playing fit or fold, which is an extreme case, but if he was literally only continuing when he hit, then bluffing as small as possible would be the optimal choice. As small as possible meaning the smallest size that would force him to fold his unpaired hands. And just a note, sort of in terms of adjustments and long matches, things that might come up in rematches or in the later stages of a match. If we're playing against this sort of boring, straightforward regular, and all of a sudden we get this, we get some sort of resistance. We get a float, or we get a float on the flop and the turn, or something to that extent. We don't want to just jump to conclusions, and we don't want to just dive in, fight fire with fire, and just assume that he's adjusting to our aggressive strategy. I think it would be a bit presumptuous to assume that not only is he bad enough to be fit or fold, but he's also good enough later on in the match to realize that he was fit or fold, and then to go back and exploit our exploitation of his fit or fold play. That's a pretty big long shot from what it seems. So we don't want to jump to too many conclusions. We want to know when to give up, basically. So having covered that, we'll look at sort of the adjustments to make against a loose passive fish in these same situations. So against the loose passive fish, I mentioned earlier that his stats might look something in the ballpark of 90-25, which would be a 25% pre-flop raise. But the other thing that you'll notice is that because he's loose and passive, is that he's not going to want to fold the 3-bets. So while 25% is a tight, while it's a very tight raising range, we can still widen our value range because he's never going to put us in those difficult situations that the tag regular might put us in. He's going to give us a series of very easy situations, despite being 150 big blinds deep, to the point where being 150 big blinds deep shouldn't really frighten us about getting stacks in. It should really just encourage us to make bigger bets, to value bet more frequently across more streets, and to just get an extremely large amount of value out of pretty much the same value of strong hands that we might have considered strong at a 75 or 100 big blind stack. We need to keep in mind, I guess first of all, before considering 3-betting, that he's going to be limping a lot of hands. I mean, obviously 90%, if that's our suggested example, is just, close to anything, except for the 9-2 offsuit type hands. So, first of all, we're going to raise his limps with a wide range of hands, and I don't go into specifics, but the idea at 150 big blinds is that we're going to be pretty much raising hands that we're comfortable, raising hands that we're pretty comfortable value betting for 3 streets when we make our hand. That doesn't mean that we can't necessarily raise something like 7-8 suited, despite the fact that we can't always value bet an 8 for 3 streets, because 7-8 suited has the added equity. I mean, its ability to flop well is going to add value to that equation. But primarily, we're going to want to raise a pretty strong value range. Obviously, all the hands that I've listed above, but also hands like Jack 9, Jack 10, probably the lower end of like the Broadway type hands, and a variety, of suited aces and strong kings and things like that. But the general idea is that we need to be confident that with all this money behind, that we're going to be comfortable betting 3 streets for value against this player. And with the loose passive fish, I think that we can be pretty confident with a wider value range than against normal players. So the note that I'm making here is that despite the fact that he's call happy, he loves to, or rather he hates to fold, being loose and passive, we need to keep in mind that he is only raising 25% of hands pre-flop. So 3-betting something like Queen 9 suited for value is a little bit optimistic. Or 3-betting something like Ace 8 or King 10 off. This is getting a little bit optimistic about how thinly we can value 3-bet against his range. So we do need to keep in mind that anything that we're choosing to 3-bet for value has to actually beat his range when he continues for it to be a value 3-bet. So just something to be careful of and not to end up accidentally value counting ourselves. So again, we're expecting this player to be loose. We're expecting this player to continue a lot. He opens a strong range. He calls with it, and he's going to connect with the flop pretty frequently in that situation. 3-bet pots, I mean. In limp pots, it's a little bit. If we're raising his limps, we can bluff a decent amount of flops. But I think that particularly in 3-bet pots, we should really avoid bluffing as a c-bet. The only situations that I would suggest c-betting in are just extremely obvious ones. Maybe the 15 or 20% of the time where we get just perfect c-bet situations on king high dry or ace high dry. But what we're going to, we really just need to focus on who we're playing against here. This is someone who we're going to make a lot of money against from value betting. So really, we need to just avoid getting any sort of fancy play, and just continuing to bet our strong hands and continuing to give up if we don't connect with the board. This last point is sort of obvious, but just keeping in mind that the loose passive player is generally not going to. Well, I shouldn't say generally not, but unless we have a read that he's actually going to, that I wouldn't rely on the loose passive fish to bluff with a missed draw. I would expect him just to check back his 8 high or whatever. and I think we should be primarily concerned about just getting 3 streets of value out of the times that he has pairs. But this is obviously extremely situational, and hopefully something that I'll be able to address in a later video when I actually get some live play against one of these types of players. So finally, we look at the same situation against the Maniac. Obviously, this is a situation where we need to embrace the variance of poker, because we're going to be reasonably tempted to, I guess, go to war, so to speak. And so what I say here is that we should be 3-betting reasonably wide against him. I wouldn't be afraid of 3-betting something like King-Jack suited, despite being 150 big blinds deep. But I say when allowed. And the reason I say when allowed is because we need to keep in mind that this is someone who's very capable of 4-betting, perhaps frequently. And unless we know exactly how to continue against a 4-bet, we need to be really careful about 3-betting certain hands that have merit in defending. For example, if we were to 3-bet something like King-10 offsuit against this player, because he's opening so many buttons and he never folds to 3-bet, so obviously we can 3-bet King-10 for value. But if he's 4-betting us a quarter of the time, then we get into some pretty tricky situations. Because first of all, we're 150 big blinds deep. We obviously don't feel good about getting all in with King-10, even if he is fighting against us a lot. That's extremely, extremely thin for as far as our equity against whatever range we're getting it in against. And there's just so many better ways to play the hand against him. Another thing that we can consider, which is something that probably doesn't come up very often in shorter stack play. Sorry, that's actually too far. Well, whatever. So another thing to consider is that we can actually 3-bet certain hands with the intention of calling a 4-bet. And this is, something sort of, I guess, a little fancy, but also unique to deep stack play, is that if we're playing someone like this, who's opening a lot of buttons, 3-betting a lot, 4-betting a lot, 5-betting a lot, just getting a lot of money in before the flop, it might actually be a good idea, rather than just trying to figure out, perfect stack-off ranges at 150 big blinds, to take advantage of the fact that if he makes it 3 big blinds and we make it 9 with King-Queen suited, and then he makes it 24, we can actually peel here and see a flop with 2 pot-sized bets behind, and a really strong hand against his range that flops really well, plays really easily. It's just really obvious when we have a strong enough hand to get it in, for the most part. So these are things to consider and things to fool around with when we're given the opportunity. But just something to realize that we have alternatives to simply getting into this 3-bet, 5-bet war. We really have a lot of room for creativity at 150 big blinds, because we're not simply restricted to, the old 3x and then 3-bet to 9 big blinds, and then either jam or fold, or call, I guess. So like I said, he's going to get a lot of money in pre-flop. He's willing to stack off lightly if he's allowed to, but allowed to is the key. We have the choice to not allow him to do this. Basically here I just reinforce the fact that we can 3-bet wide, things like King-10 for value if they flat a wide range, but if they 4-bet a wide range, then again, proceed with caution. Another adjustment is that when all this money is going in pre-flop, we need to accordingly adjust our post-flop sort of relative hand strengths. If our opponent is opening 100% of his buttons, and then fighting back against every 3-bet, then by the time we get, 20 big blinds in pre-flop, or in a 4-bet pot, if we get in 45 big blinds pre-flop, then we need to realize that even though we might only flop second pair, or we might only flop 2 overcards and a gut shot, or we might flop, I don't know, we might have tens on a queen high flop or something like that. These are not bad situations against this player. We need to realize effectively that we're dealing with. I mean, we should think in terms of how much money is behind compared to the size of the pot, the stack to pot ratio. If the stack to pot ratio is only 2 or 3 going to the flop, then the fact that we only have second pair doesn't really sound as bad as it normally does. I mean, sure, it's 150 big blinds, but again, we have to realize who we're playing against right now. I mean, obviously this is why I said prepare for variance, but if they're folding to our pre-flop bets less often, then their average holding at showdown is going to be weaker. So we need to make sure not to get fixed into a mindset of certain hand strengths at certain stack depths are acceptable to get it in with. Not everyone reacts the same way, and we need to be a little bit more. We need to be a little bit more fluid in our thought process. We need to. I mean, I know this is vague, but we just need to pay close attention to these tendencies, and we need to accordingly adjust. So, my last slide here, which I'm sure everyone watching this video who hasn't fallen asleep yet is very upset about it being the last slide, is going to be some general takeaway points about playing post-flop while extremely deep. And I'll try and give a couple hand history examples to back this one up. So, something that I notice at short stack play, which is fairly self-explanatory, is a high level of aggression with a wide variety of draws. With short stacks, it's usually a no-brainer to check raise and get it in with the nut flush draw, raise and get it in with a pair to flush draw, check raise and get it in with an overcard straight draw, things like this. These are all fairly no-brainer situations in short stack play, just because the math dictates that there's no way that we're getting away from the hand, and that the wide pre-flop ranges make our fold equity great enough that we're usually taking the optimal line. But having said that, with 150 big blinds, how happy are we really getting stacks in a single raise pot with a naked draw? Because frequently now we're looking at 40 or 45% equity in a 300 big blind pot, which is going to require a lot more fold equity than before to make up for the fact that we're losing all that equity, or rather that we're losing a small amount of equity in a much larger pot. So one major advantage here to playing draws a little more passively at 150 big blinds is that if we're playing against reasonably strong ranges, we shouldn't expect our opponent to adjust as well as we are to the depth of stacks. So, for example, if we're facing heat with a naked flush draw or with an open-ended straight draw from a tight player, the deep stacks encourage us to continue with our hand, because even if we're not getting immediate odds to continue, the implied odds of 150 big blinds behind rather than 75 or 50 big blinds behind make it far more valuable to complete our draw when he's not going to be able to get away from an overpair or a set or a two pair or a straight or what have you. And hopefully I have some decent examples of where this might come into play. So here I have a cash hand, and I apologize to those of you viewing this on a sit and go website in lieu of the recent 2+2 divide, but Nonetheless, it's much easier for me to search for cash hands, and I have a much larger sample of cash hands. So my best examples here are unfortunately from cash. So that said, the important thing here is that we have 125 big blind effective stacks against someone who I would consider to be a reasonably, not passive, but a reasonably loose fish who's a little bit aggressive. So what we have here is just a basic draw situation. We flop a straight flush draw, nine outs to the flush, 3 additional outs to the gut shot, which at short stacks is really a no-brainer situation to get it in. And the way this exact hand plays out doesn't perfectly illustrate my point, but there's a couple ways that we can look at this here. So in this situation, I bet 20 into 24, and if we were to face a check raise here, we are generally looking at a board where, for example, from this player, I would suspect we're going to see top pair a pretty frequent amount of the time. That said, we're blocking some flush draws, so it's a little bit more difficult. Well, I suppose, I mean, he has a few less flush draws in his range because we have 2 of the clubs. But that said, we lose to everything. I mean, we have the nut low here. So our goal in this hand is one of 2 things. We either want to get the last bet in, which is a concept that's reasonably important when we have low draws, is that getting the final bet into the pot allows us to have fold equity over his bluffs that beat us. It would be a disaster if we let him get the last bet in with Queen Jack here, because Queen Jack is a total bluff but has a lot of equity against us, so that sucks. So one goal here would be to get the last bet in. If we were at 75 big blinds here, it would be really easy to get the last bet in against a check raise. We would c-bet to 20, he would check raise to 60, we would jam for 250, and that would be extremely profitable. I have no doubt that would be the best play. But given that we're at 125 big blinds, it's a little bit trickier when he makes it 60 here. Now we have a couple options. Jamming would be risking 470 to win 100. And I'm not going to bore everyone to death doing a lot of math on screen here, but obviously risking 470 to win 100 is a much worse proposition than the situation where we're 75 big blinds deep and we'd be risking about 260 to win 100. So, that said, we have another option. We can call the 40 with 420 behind, which is better than 10 to 1 implied odds, in addition to the better than 2 to 1 immediate odds that we'd be getting. So, it's a pretty clear situation in my mind that we should be calling if he makes it 60 here. We have great implied odds against his value hands, and in a lot of situations, because we have a combo draw here, we can call the turn in addition to calling the flop, even if we don't get there. Because with these deepest stacks, if the pot on the turn was, say, 140, and he was to bet 100, there would still be 320 behind after that 100, meaning we're still getting over 3 to 1 implied, and we're already getting better than 2 to 1 immediate. So these are still situations where it's sort of a rare case where we're deep enough that we can face 2 bets, and for that reason we're going to get all the way to the river at a profitable price, which is a great situation because we don't have to take an aggressive line against a strong range with 4 high. That said, what actually happened here was that he made an extremely large check raise, and I imagine, because of the way that I played this, that there was some sort of game flow going on, because I still think that there's merit to calling here, especially if we think that he's got a strong hand. But I did go ahead and jam here because, I mean, again, we're not 150 big blinds deep here. We're 125, which is slightly better for jamming. And also, he made it 84 here instead of 60, which is a really big difference. We're risking 460 to win. Almost 150 in this case, which is 3-to-1 risk reward, rather than the previous situation, which was almost 5-to-1 risk reward if he had made it 60. So I believe this is the other situation I wanted to show. So again, here we open with 3-4 clubs. Apparently I flop a lot of straight flush draws with 3-4 clubs in my database. But anyways, here we're playing against someone who appears to be more of a tag. And in this situation against the tag, we actually happen to be 150 big blinds deep, which is perfect because this is the situation I wanted to bring up on the full tilt structure in deep stack sit and goes. So we flop a straight flush draw here. Obviously, we have an easy c-bet. And for whatever reason, I make it 17 instead of 20 here, which is my standard at this stack depth. But for whatever, that said, when we get check raised to 52 here, I think it would be a really, really terrible play to 3-bet. I think it would be absolutely way worse than calling to 3-bet here. Getting stacks in here with 4 high, having 3-bet, and then being the one calling the jam is just a really atrocious situation, especially when he shows up with something like 7-9 of clubs. And his value range here is extremely strong. Hands like ace-5, ace-6, 5s and 6s, hands like ace-x of clubs. It's just a huge disaster to get in all that money. So I do call, and we get a turn that completes some of his draws, 7-8 obviously, but we still have, again, we still have a huge amount of money behind. So again, I think raising here is bad. I think that his value range is never folding. He has a very strong range here of 5, 6s, 7, 8, ace-5, ace-6, perhaps even ace-9 that check raised the flop. And I think that if we didn't have so much money behind, we would actually be forced to fold here, because we're not getting an immediate price to draw to our hand, especially considering some of our outs might be tainted against something like 9-8 of clubs, ace-7 of clubs, things like that. But being this deep, we have the luxury of calling here again, but unfortunately I don't have the luxury of running well enough to get there. So the other point that I want to make about playing this deep is keep in mind the new relative strength of your hand. I think it's fairly standard at 70 big blinds to just check raise the vast majority of our top pairs, especially on draw heavy flops. And at 150 big blinds, this can be a serious problem. Not only can it be a problem for us to check raise top pair, because we have to deal with 2 more streets of betting. We have to deal with another 120, 125 big blinds being behind and having no idea what to do because we're really not comfortable getting all that money in with our hand. On top of this, we need to keep in mind if our opponent is doing these things. If our opponent is still check raising any top pair, then what can we do to give him trouble? Well, we can put him at risk for 150 big blinds. We have the option of calling down twice with our big draws. We have the option of all these great things that we can do to fight against him check raising too frequently. And really these are things that I want to address in another video where you actually get to watch me play, because it's difficult to describe on paper, but it's really, really going to be bad if our opponent is going too thinly for value, if he's getting in draws too frequently and making all these mistakes that I've been talking about. Effectively what this means is that we need to I mean, I don't like to call it pot control, but basically what we just need to do is we need to realize how strong a hand is against our opponent, and we need to appropriate the way that money goes into the pot because of that. And that might mean check calling top pair second kicker against a strong opponent, just because we know that check raising it is too thin for value, and that he can give us a hard time. And the last thing I want to talk about, just briefly, is sizing your bets well in these situations. An example here I wanted to show is a 3-6 hand that I played a little while ago. This was actually over the summer. As you can probably tell, my standard C-bet in this situation is a little bit larger than maybe at 50 or 75 big blinds, where it might be standard to C-bet half pot. I think it's fairly. I think it makes sense to increase your bet size on the flop and on every street with increasing stack depths, just because of the ability to leverage your entire stack, or as much of your stack as possible. And here we get check raised. So here, I mean, I don't think this is too thin for value, because he has top pair top kicker, and because people generally have trouble folding top pair on a draw heavy board. Obviously, I had trouble folding second pair, so I think that his play is definitely fine. What I was referring to, what I think might be too thin at these stack depths is something like 9-8. Without reads, I think that's actually quite terrible. But my point is that he needs to realize here that he has 3 times the pot behind, and he needs to find a way to get stacks in against worse hands. And what he does here is he bet 138. Personally, I think that he left too much money behind here, and I think that he should be betting something like 151, 155. But really, I mean, I'm just nitpicking about the fact that the pot's going to be 470 and he's going to have 530 behind, and he's going to have to make a slight overbet to get stacks in here on the river. So I do think that that was a small mistake. Again here, this is a situation where we're even deeper, 200 big blinds deep. He does continue to check raise a strong top pair here. This is a pretty good regular that I'm playing against. But point being is that, again, he's leveraging a small part of his stack here by betting 88 instead of something like 112. And then he's forced to only bet 180 on the river. I don't think he could actually get stacks in here, but point being is that he could put me in tougher decisions with all this money behind by betting larger, forcing me to risk a larger percentage of my stack, and that's really something that you can try and take advantage of when you're 150 big blinds deep. So, for now, that is all I've got. Hopefully this was a nice introduction to deep stack play, and hopefully nobody fell asleep during this, because I know that PowerPoints are not the most interesting way to learn poker. But I did want to give you guys a nice overview of sort of the things that I'm thinking about, so that when I'm actually sitting at the table and I talk about these things, it's not an overwhelming amount of information. So that said, I'm going to wrap up my first video here, and I hope you guys liked it. Please, comment or PM me on 2+2. I'm Bearwire there. And anyways, good luck at the tables.